Now it's President Putin's turn. And if he's not coming to the table, I would expect you would see President Trump actually starting to use other levers, as he was already threatening before with economic sanctions. Well, good evening here from Sydney.
Oh, good evening to you. It's great to have you on the programme today. I want to get your perspective on a few of the moving parts on this Ukraine-Russia deal. Anthony Albanese spoke to Keir Starmer at the weekend. There is a talk of this coalition of the willing. Is that something that Australia should be participating in?
Well, Australia was one of the first to come out and support Ukraine, and the principle behind that, I was Prime Minister at the time, was to prevent a successful invasion of Ukraine, and that has, by and large, been achieved. I mean, they haven't been able to run, and thank God for that. It's now 3 years on, and I'm very hopeful that the President will be able to achieve a peace. It's obviously the ball's in Moscow's court, but I imagine and fairly certain that he will take the same approach quite strongly with President Putin as he has with President Zelensky in getting people to the table. So what then of a peacekeeping or other force that can hold a peace should it be achieved? Well, I think the President has been very clear that looking at his President Trump, that he wishes to reset effectively where the weight of US effort is around the world, not to reduce their effort, but to rebalance it. And that is much more towards the region we are in here, in the Indo-Pacific. And that means Europe and its partners would take a lead role in any response to keeping the peace. Now, what role for Australia? Well, it's not our theatre, but that said, I think Australia would provide a support to this and should, given what's at stake. But if it were to come to actually committing troops and things of that nature, then I think that would very much outside our spheres of responsibility.
So it would be less likely to be troops, more likely to be intelligence, I assume, is what you're suggesting?
Well, not just that, but I mean, we've been supporting with lethal aid and humanitarian aid as well, and I would see no reason why we wouldn't continue to play a role in that. But in terms of actual troops and things of that nature, well, we have priorities in other parts of the world and in our partnerships in other parts of the world, particularly in relation to the Indo-Pacific. So you could expect us to focus those resources there.
Do you think Australia should rule out altogether troops? Because one of the questions here at the moment for the government in the UK is Keir Starmer is promising this coalition of the willing, but it doesn't seem that many EU nations beyond the UK and France are willing to commit those boots on the ground. It sounds like Australia wouldn't either. Is that, I mean, are you ruling that out? Do you think it should be ruled out?
Well, I can only speak to what I think probably should or shouldn't be. I no longer have that decision. But no, we shouldn't be doing that. And but we should look to other forms of assistance. But I generally applaud Sir Keir Starmer's, the way he's engaged with the new president. I think he's been a bit of a standout in that respect. I think he's very, very professional and focused on the task at hand and not getting caught up in a lot of the other things that have been going on. And secondly, you know, he got the message, went back, started to try and put together a coalition as to how such a peace could be maintained. And that's very much in the UK's interest to do that, but not just the UK. It's in all of Europe's interest to do that. And they are the ones who should be doing that. It is their region, it's their theatre. They are advanced, developed economies with sophisticated defence systems and should be able to deploy to ensure regional security in that domain.
The Five Eyes Agreement, the intelligence sharing agreement between Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and America, it's been a stable partnership for quite some time. Obviously, America pulled out, the US pulled its intelligence to the US, caused lots of questions to be asked about the future of Five Eyes. Do you see the US as a stable and reliable partner in intelligence sharing now?
Absolutely. And I don't think this alters that. I mean...
How does it not alter that?
Well, because you don't go into all of these particular events as a collective. Everybody has their own capabilities, and there are ways that is shared between all of us. But how individual parties share what they have access to with third parties outside the agreement is a matter for them. So I think there's perhaps a bit of a misunderstanding about how the Five Eyes works.
I think it was interpreted at a time of huge global instability as a fracturing of that agreement, and that was sending a certain message to Russia at a time when maybe other partners were hoping for more unity, that Donald Trump is prepared to go it alone and not necessarily be as steadfast in his support of those groups as he had been in the past.
No, I think that's a misread. I think what the president is trying to do here is end a war that has reached a stalemate And for the last 3 years, we have been engaged in this at terrible cost to everybody involved, most significantly the people of Ukraine. And where does this end? I mean, where does it end? I mean, it's different to other conflicts because the goal here, I cannot see from any of the supporting partners, is to defeat Russia and roll tanks into Moscow and find Putin in a bunker somewhere. That's not the objective. And in fact, if that were the objective, then I think we'd be seeing an even more calamitous result. So after 3 years, the invasion has been frustrated. Territory, yes, has been taken. But where does it go from here? The invasion has been resisted. And I recall at the time, there was the consistent intelligence that was saying this thing would be over in a week. Now it wasn't. And that's to the great credit of Ukraine, President Zelensky, and all of us who came to their aid and resisted that. But now you have to look at these questions practically. And what happens next? You've got to get the parties around a table, and you've got to bring this to a peaceful conclusion, and you've got to have a security arrangement that enables the peace to be maintained. And I think President Zelensky and Ukraine more generally has every right to be very, very suspicious of Putin's motives. He's broken his word on these things before. That only heightens the task that Europe and the UK have to be engaged in to ensure that can be guaranteed. Now, what role for the United States? Well, my experience of the president is he always he's open to a discussion and he's persuadable, but he has to start with what you're going to do.
I mean, you are close to Donald Trump. You know him really well. Lots of people were deeply disappointed by his approach to Russia. I mean, let's be frank. People interpreted it as him opening up the hand of friendship to President Putin at a time when, Ukraine is feeling like it would really desperately want America's support. Were you disappointed in the way that he approached Russia?
Well, the thing I learned about President Trump is you've got to look what he's trying to achieve. And I would certainly agree with you. He's very unorthodox and very unconventional. But actually, that's what the people of the United States voted for. He wasn't presenting himself as anything other than that. And what is the objective? It's actually to get both parties to the table. Now, as he said publicly, the other party's not going to come to the table if you keep abusing them. He's got to change President Putin's calculus, and he had to change Ukraine's calculus. Now, I commend President Zelensky for the way he's got on board with this. Now it's President Putin's turn. And if he's not coming to the table, I would expect you would see President Trump actually starting to use other levers, as he was already threatening before with economic sanctions. He's a president that would prefer not to get involved in conflicts. I mean, he was the first president in his first term not to have put the Americans' boots on the ground in a conflict in a generation. So that's his disposition. But at the same time, I don't think President Putin would doubt his resolve in terms of what he might do next in order to get him to the table, because that's what he wants. He's not trying to support President Putin. He's trying to get peace. And if Putin's not turning up to the table, well, I'd expect him to take some action to remedy that.
Many people think that really Donald Trump's endgame is China, that's where his attention is most focused, and that the West is getting distracted by Russia. Do you think that's an opportunity for China? If the West is all focused on President Putin, that China might think, now's the time. Is that a risk?
I'd put it this way. I mean, this has been happening for some time now, at least to the middle of the last decade and perhaps earlier, frankly, ever since President Xi took over power. And that is that the global risk of a major global conflict is now in the Indo-Pacific. And that has been the case for some time. And frankly, the only nation that can provide the real deterrent to that type of threat is the United States, in partnership with its allies and partners, particularly in our region. I mean, this is what spurred on AUKUS when I was Prime Minister, which involved then Boris Johnson, but now Sir Keir Starmer has been fully supportive of it, and I commend him for taking that position, as has President Trump. It was signed under President Biden. So that is the centre, if you like, of global risk when it comes to these issues. And understandably, the US would be wanting to rebalance and reset its focus in that area. Now, don't forget, this began under President Bush. President Obama sought to make the great pivot. This has been going on for probably 20 years, but it's now been accelerated because of the rising threat of China in the Indo-Pacific. And let's not forget, if Taiwan were to fall, then that would be felt in every corner of the globe. Now, that's not to say what's happening in the Ukraine is unimportant. It's terribly unimportant. And that's why countries that are as far away as Australia were so quick to step in and provide support because of what was at stake. But you've got to sort of understand where these conflicts sit in the broader picture. And I think that's been an enduring position that people like Secretary Rubio have been articulating for a very long time, as has former Congressman Mike Waltz, and now the National Security Advisor. So I don't think the question, I think, where you're getting to is the shift on to focus on the Indo-Pacific and China. Well, yes, and there are very good reasons for that.
One of the questions about the future for Ukraine is about where the line will be drawn. If there is a ceasefire deal, if Russia comes to the table, what next? Russia has taken territory from Ukraine. Many people have a fear that Donald Trump will be willing to essentially hand that territory over to Russia, that will just become Russian and there's nothing that can be done about it. He sort of indicated that fact. Is that the right place to end up? Would you be happy with that? Or would you urge Donald Trump to make some kind of agreement to ensure that Ukraine regains some of that territory that it's lost?
Well, this is why I'm pleased to see how President Zelensky has engaged. I'm very pleased that he has, because he's now in the room. He's now part of the process. And ultimately, you need to secure a peace that can be held. And look, I'm not going to second guess those discussions. But what matters is that you can come to a conclusion that can stick and that people stay on both sides of their line. And that is what Europe needs as well. So, unless you're sitting in that room and the trade-offs that are involved, I think it's brave to adventure some, finite view on, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing.
But you don't think morally that Ukraine should be given some of the territory that Russia invaded and took from it back as part of any deal?
Well, the borders of every nation should be sovereign. Of course they should be. But that's not the situation we're faced with here. As I said, if you want to get rid of the threat here, he's called Vladimir Putin and he lives in Moscow. And unless we're going to roll the tanks into Moscow, then what's the next position?
Yeah.
And so I think, drawing parallels, which I've seen some do with what was occurring back in the late 30s, I don't see it the same way. Because the objective then was to roll the tanks into Berlin and to absolutely defeat the enemy. And so that's what I think we have to be careful of when we sort of look at those issues. We draw the right comparisons, frankly, understand the real politic of this. Because if we don't, then we risk a bloody conflict which will only get worse, and we go past a point where we potentially start to diminish the returns of an agreement that can be achieved for Ukraine in their interests.
Scott Morrison, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Vice Chair of American Global Strategy. Really great to have you with us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time. Nice to be with you. All the best.